Good morning, everybody. My name is Knut Blind. I'm head of the Standards Academy of Stand ICT 26. And today we have the third webinar on the geopolitics of ICT standardization. This time we focus on China. And we have four very kind of distinguished guests with us. Next slide, please. Which are going into details about China and standardization. I give a brief intro, but I do not really kind of to eat up too much time because we have four speakers and they have very interesting things to share with us. First will be Tim Rühlig from the European Union Institute for Security Studies. I will introduce him a little bit more later. Then we have Daniel Fuchs from the Humboldt University in Berlin. That means we are not following the tradition ladies first, but here gentlemen first, because then we have Susan Lüttke, who is also an expert in China studies from Würzburg University and also affiliated to Bonn. And finally, also very important, Betty Xu, who is responsible for the collaboration between European and Chinese standardization activities. Okay, next slide, please. We have some very brief housekeeping rules. It means, as you realized, the event will be recorded and will be also made available after the event, including also the presentation of the speakers. We are very interested in an interactive session. Therefore, if you have questions, please raise them in the Q&A box, which you can find in the lower toolbar. And then the speakers try to answer them later. And also we have a slot at the end for discussion. And there will be also more information shared in the chat. That's from the admin side. Now I share my slides. So I will talk a little bit about technological sovereignty, which is a topic we worked on, and the link to standardization and standards, which might be a safeguard for technological sovereignty. First, a brief motivation. Why is this topic really kind of very important and also raising significant importance in the last few years? And then I will present some ideas and thoughts about how standardization and standards is linked to technological sovereignty. But then I will hand over to our speakers. But nevertheless, if we have some time, we might talk about some proposition and policy recommendations I developed, and also what are the challenges we are going to face. The competition in technology has been increased in the last decades, and also especially more and more in the last years, and we see also Europe a little bit under pressure. And meanwhile, we see also a link of technologies to whole systems and also values, which has been especially made kind of visible in the European standardization strategy published in 22, but also in the US standardization strategy 23. And the relevance of the topic is even kind of further pushed by the war in the Ukraine, the Russian attack, and also the follow-up problems we faced also in supply chains. In kind of the follow-up discussions, there were also then more and more voices which claim to maybe have a more protectionist kind of attitude in order to save the own kind of resources and the access to technology. And since I'm an innovation researcher, we combine that with innovation policy rationales, which are, on the one hand, at least in the past, have focused on competitiveness. Now, kind of, there's more the focus on transformations and also missions. But now we have new issues on the table, like security, defense, and also the already mentioned value discussions. We used kind of some existing theories in order to develop our idea of technological sovereignty. And we define that, and you find that especially in a paper published last year by Jacob Edler, my boss, and some colleagues in research policy. And we define it as an ability of a state or federation of states to develop technology it deems critical for its welfare, competitiveness, and ability to act, or source them from other economic areas to avoid one-sided structural dependencies. It's really also a dynamic concept. And we focus a little bit on the technology side. There's also maybe innovation sovereignty or economic sovereignty as such. But now, what's the link to standardization? And here we have different aspects, how standardization and standards can assure technological sovereignty. First, we need the human resources, because the involvement in standardization is key. And here, Europe faces also kind of a demographic problem, which is maybe more severe than in other countries. Also, directly connected that R&D results are inputs into standardization processes. We just kind of published in spring the European Standardization Panel survey, where we show that from the experts' perspective, R&D, but also the market, that means what the consumers and customers want, and also policies are the three main sources relevant for standardization. Now, a little bit more in detail, scientific publications are also a base for standards, especially in more science-driven areas. And if you have scientific publications in general, they are open, and openness is very important for technological sovereignty. We know in ICT, and we might talk about that also a little bit later, that here standard essential patents are an important instrument. Although they are proprietary in character, if they are declared, then it's possible to implement the standards which are based on these patents. More and more open source is connected, or the base of standards, and in contrast to proprietary software, this is also available for everybody and also then contributes to the technological sovereignty. Innovation overall is key, because it promotes competitiveness. It also delivers new solutions which might reduce also the dependencies from other already existing technologies, and therefore also contributes to technological sovereignty. Trade, originally kind of the idea was, okay, if you are involved in standard setting, you can set standards in a way to increase your competitiveness. But in the context of technological sovereignty, it's not only about export promotion, but also it's also about kind of securing the import of very important technologies for assuring the technological sovereignty of your country. Last point, policy and regulation also refers to standards, for example, regarding public procurement. And if you do that, if you refer especially to international standards, then you might really kind of create an ecosystem of many different suppliers, reducing the dependency on one specific supplier. And the other aspect to mention here is international standards might also contribute to the harmonization of regulatory frameworks, which is also an important aspect which might contribute to technological sovereignty. This was, from my perspective, kind of the brief intro, which might also give food for thoughts for follow-up speakers, but also for the participants. And now I hand over to Tim Rühlig, who is really the expert for China. Now, since a few days, he is senior analyst for Asia and Global China at the European Union Institute for Security Studies. He has a long tradition working on the topic. In particular, he was also a fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations and also a research fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, where he kind of really developed his really great portfolio on expertise on the topic. Therefore, I was quite happy to get him on board after he just recently changed the job to his new institution. Tim, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Knut, and for everyone for inviting me this morning or afternoon in China. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you, but also with fantastic colleagues who will speak after me, and I'm really looking forward and very keen to hear what they have to say. I'll start out with a presentation that discusses the title. The title is China and the New Geopolitics of Technical Standardization. Surely, technical standard setting to some extent has always been political. So the question is a bit sort of what is new? But of course, also standardization is much more than just the geopolitics. And I'm sure we're going to discuss this in other presentations further. So I'm taking maybe a bit of a specific angle here. So don't sort of expect that I grasp the entirety of the standardization landscape. Now, I think I can be quite quick on this first slide that you already see, because Knut, I think, has given you already a bit of context. I think what is sort of relevant to understand is the central importance that strategic technological change is playing in three intertwined mega transformations. One is, of course, the digital transformation. I don't think I need to sort of go in detail and explain what that means. Also, the green transformation, I think, pretty self-explanatory. And then, of course, the power shift that we sort of see, at least the questioning to what extent the United States and its allies are dominating the world to the extent that they have for many decades. What I think is relevant to see is here how these three mega trends or mega transformations are intertwined. Digital and green, I think, again, rather straightforward. There's, of course, what in the European Union context is being called the twin transition. So actually, that digital technology is being used for the green transformation as well. So there's overlap. But also, I think, and that is probably the overlap that is most relevant in the context of today's discussion, is the intersection of this power shift with digital and the green transformation. And that, whether for good or for bad, I think implies that the great powers seem to exercise the growing rivalry and power competition, not only, but to a significant extent in the area of industrial leadership, but also innovation leadership in the digital and green fields. And that implies that sort of the development and the production of these technologies have become a central component of this competition. Now, innovation as such, of course, does not necessarily translate directly into power. Sure, innovation has often strengthened the military capabilities of countries. Innovation is also, by trend at least, strengthening, of course, the economic influence of countries. The political reputation, the general reputation may be better if you are innovative, if people sort of see the quality of your technologies. But of course, it's also about political strategy, the organization, market power. So there are a number of intervening variables. So innovation does not directly translate into power, but innovation leadership is, by many countries, surely China and the United States, seen as a means to power, among other things. If you go to the next slide, please. The question then is, of course, how do technical standard setting fit into this? And I think the technical standards are really an unlikely candidate for this geopolitical competition over innovation between the US and its allies on the one hand and China on the other. In Europe, we can discuss whether it's a third force or whether it falls into the camp of the US or not. But however we precisely sort of configure that, technical standards, that's my point, are an unlikely candidate. Why is that? Technical standards are basically about safety and interoperability. So they don't follow this rather exclusive logic that we see in many of these competitions over innovation, with export controls, with screening of investments, etc. All this is sort of to limit or even to exclude the competitors from certain technologies or from certain markets. That is not the case with technical standards. They aim for safety and interoperability. They're technical in nature, not political. So if you read a technical standard, if you're not an engineer, this is really difficult to grasp. So the political content is not very obvious. And technical standards are mostly private sector driven, not necessarily state driven, although this may be sort of shifting a bit, but also only to some extent. As I said, technical standards, open, inclusive, voluntary. So at least if we consider sort of the formal standards, what we can see is that standard developing organizations are open to everyone. They are quite transparent. You see what's happening. And once they adopt a technical standard, it's voluntary. It's not mandatory to apply that technical standard. So in a way, how it's really not following this excluding logic of the geopolitical competition. So in what ways then are technical standards play a role here? The first is that we see what I call a weaponization of interdependence, or I mean, not I have invented that term, but what sort of is important here is lock-in dependencies. So technical standards do provide interoperability. They help sort of to apply certain technological solutions and make them adaptable to their technological environment. If these technical standards are international, if they are global, then of course you can create sort of a global market, because if you all agree on sort of one standard, then essentially all relevant technologies or products around the globe are interoperable. But if you sort of see a fragmentation, if a standard is not globally adopted, but if you see sort of a divergent standards across countries, then of course you do create separate spheres. Within those technological spheres, you have technical interoperability, but not between them. And thereby you, of course, create these lock-in dependencies that you can't easily switch from one to another. And that, of course, provides states with the potential, at least, to use then these technological lock-ins to pressure others. And that's a concern. A second element is the technical standards, just as any technology, is not value-free. It's not value-neutral. So whether you standardize a solution that favors privacy over performance or the other way around is a choice. But technical standards, they are technical in nature, so they're rather discrete in sort of not being so. It's not so clear because they don't talk about these. They don't write about these values that are implicitly enshrined, and thereby people may not always sort of notice. And then, of course, you start to also see state-led standardization strategies. You have this in China, you have this in the EU, you have this in the United States. So you see in recent years, 2021, 2022, 2023, all three major entities have released a standardization strategy, sort of showing an interest of public actors in standard setting. So that is also an indicator that states appear sort of more prominently in this process. And finally, I think what is really important, and that maybe links back also to or has implications for lock-in dependencies or also the value dimension, is technical standards tend to be transformative because they create network effects. What does that mean? So if you have a technical standard applied and other technologies rely on that. Say, for example, you have Wi-Fi as a connector for wireless networks. And then you have a number of devices, computers, smartphones, tablets, and so on and so forth, being able to connect that. Then you hesitate to invent a new technical standard that replaces Wi-Fi, because then you would also need to adapt all the other devices that connect with it. These are network effects. And that means that technical standards tend to be long-living and thereby transformative. So you don't change them easily. And that is sort of, if you combine that sort of with lock-in dependencies, with values enshrined, that means that the effects that you create with technical standards are quite long-lasting. The next slide. I'll become a bit faster and now get also to China. But I thought it is quite sort of relevant to sort of understand why China and other countries are really sort of carefully considering technical standards in recent years. So China has traditionally not been a very strong international standardization power, but that has changed gradually over time, though to divergent degrees in different developing organizations. So let's maybe take just very quickly 2 examples here. In the international standard, in ISO, the International Standardization Organization, you see on your right-hand side on the top, but then sort of the left graph, the increasing share of leadership positions or secretariat positions in technical committees and subcommittees of ISO. So in 2011, you had around 4%. Now in 2022, it was slightly below 10%. I think I've seen on a slide that Betty will show later on that it has exceeded now 10%. So you sort of see a gradual upward trend of China taking more and more technical leadership positions. You also see, if you go to the International Telecommunications Union, ITU-T, which is sort of the branch that has the most technical standards being developed, that China has the most members. Now, most of them are academic members, so the sector members and the associate members are sort of a bit more influential in the system. There, China is still sort of behind the United States. If you look at the entirety of ITU, then the United States is leading. If you look at the branch of ITU-T, then it's China. So you see China has gained there a lot. Especially if you look on the right upper side, you also sort of see a very significant upward trend in the share of contributions to ITU-T study groups. And to make sort of a long story short here, you see sort of a gradual but modest trend in Chinese participation and gain in influence in ISO, but a quite significant and even more substantial one in ITU-T. Now, this I think becomes even more sort of clear when you look at strategic sectors. I'm not going to read out the examples that I give here from ISO and IEC world. These are leadership positions that China has taken up in the last few years. These are just a few examples. Here in the ITU, this is not leadership positions. They are looked more sort of at where has China made particularly a lot of contributions, also far-reaching contributions that were adopted. So you see China is very active, not necessarily dominating in all, but very active in very strategic new technologies in the standardization. That may sort of be a bit sort of below the surface if you just look at quantitative data. But China is also active outside of these developing organizations. It has developed action plans as part of its Belt and Road Initiative and investment initiative, mostly in developing countries. It has concluded a number of bilateral agreements that explicitly speak about a technical standard setting. And most importantly, I think it is implementing its own technical standards in countries that participate in this Belt and Road Initiative in specific projects simply by exercising these projects with Chinese firms. A final aspect maybe that is interesting, and that then leads to my next slide, is that the state that the representative of China in international standard developing organizations is very often not a private organization, but the State Administration of Market Regulation and the Standards Administration of China, so essentially a state actor. Next slide, please. And that leads sort of to a development that is eyed with a bit of suspicion on the European end, also on the American end. and that is that standardization in China is much more state-driven than it is in the West. China has undergone a reform in 2017, 18, and following years. You sort of see the new system with the state tier and a market tier on the upper right side. To be very clear here, China has rather sort of shifted to the market side because it newly introduced this market tier, association standards that are not under the state tier play a bigger and bigger role in that system. So China is rather sort of liberalizing its standardization system from the Western viewpoint. But if you look at the registered standardization experts, then I can go a bit into detail. You see that more than half just quantitatively come from state institutions, state-controlled institutions. We also did a survey that's on the bottom right side among European actors, European businesses in China being involved in domestic standardization in China, and you see that state actors also feature as the most influential in that process in the view of the European companies. So that implies China has a bit of a different approach, and given sort of the context and the value of technical standards for political power as outlined above, that has sort of led to increasing concerns on the European and the US end. Now, finally, the concluding slides. I know I have only a few minutes left, so I'll very quickly talk about sort of the consequences. I think sort of, again, sort of abstracting a bit here from China, the question is sort of what are the consequences? There's an economic consequence, the distribution of standard essential patterns, adaptation costs. So there is a distributary dimension to the question, who sets actually technical standards. The legal one I skipped for reasons of time. I'm very happy to discuss afterwards. I think there's also sort of this lock-in dependencies. The question is there sort of a leverage that results from technical standardization, especially if they're developed outside of international standard developing organizations, so if they're not global in nature. So that, I think, is another consequence, and the values dimension I already touched upon. So what are then sort of the risks? And I wouldn't say these are risks that only stem here from China. But the fact that China's presence, a growing presence in international standard development, is very much perceived, at least, and I think to some extent rightly perceived, as being linked closer than in other countries, sort of a political agenda with more political actors being involved. The risk is that we see a politicization, not just on sort of the Chinese side, but also that Western states, the EU, the US, get sort of more interested in that and thereby distort a very well-functioning system that was driven by private sector actors. Another risk, I think, is fragmentation. I mean, the standards are most effective if they're global in nature. And if you have these politicization and these sort of more confrontative and less cooperative mode of action, then you run the risk of having sort of a more fragmented and thereby less impactful standardization system. And finally, from a European or US standpoint, of course, the power shift element that I think doesn't require much of explanation if my presentation so far has been convincing. So I leave it here, looking forward to the other presentations and to discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tim. Very, very insightful, very interesting, and you already got some questions to answer in the Q&A and in the chat. Therefore, in order to save time, I move on to Daniel Fuchs, who is from the Humboldt University, where he's assistant professor at the Institute for Asian and African Studies. And he's also a political scientist and works on standardization. I'm really was quite happy to have met him within the last year to find out that somebody in Berlin is also doing a habilitation on the topic, and give him the floor. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Knut, and thanks also to Maria for organizing the event, and welcome to the audience and all the panelists. I'm trying to share my slides. Can you see the slides? Perfect. Yes, thanks again and welcome again. I'm talking today about China's evolving role in international standardization, specifically with a focus on reactions by status quo powers, so to say. So different reactions by stakeholders in Germany and Europe on the one hand side, and the United States on the other hand, and I think it might fit very well with what Tim has already presented. I start with a couple of seconds of advertisement. I'm sorry about that, but recently some books have been published. So if people are interested in reading more about China and Chinese economic policy, we have a book in German that came out at the end of last year, Thinking the Future with China. On the left-hand side. On the right-hand side is a book about the World Economic Order. And for this particular webinar, I think the most valuable publication is a special issue in the journal China Information that officially came out in July, edited by Zhu Ruiyi and Miriam Thiessen, specifically on Chinese standards and standardization. Feel free to check that out. A lot of those articles are actually open access, so you can access them for free. And if you have troubles accessing articles, please don't hesitate to write me an email and I'll forward them to you. Yeah, talking about China's evolving role in international standardization, I think we need to start by putting it into a historical perspective. Tim has already mentioned at the very beginning that I think you said China standardization has always been political. And I think it's important to note that at the very beginning, if you think about China and reactions to China's rise, and if we put the so-called China challenge in standardization into perspective, then I think it's most important to highlight that it is or was stakeholders from global North countries who have historically had an outsized influence in international standardization. So the largest international SDOs such as ISO and IEC, but also the ITU, ITUT, have been dominated by global North countries, including Germany. These countries still hold the most leadership positions with regard to CEST, TCs, and SCs, but also working groups. And this is interesting in itself, I would say, because the ISO, but also other organizations have a very different aspiration. So these organizations work under the principles of openness and of inclusivity. However, I think from a sort of research perspective, we have to acknowledge that there is a different reality, and that is a reality of an exclusive club. This is not a sort of a criticism towards the ISO and the IEC per se, because there has been a lot of programs since the 60s already to elevate the capacity of so-called developing countries in standardization, but it still is, unfortunately, a reality that it is a relatively exclusive club. And therefore, scholars such as Stephan Wood argued that, I quote here, powerful economic interests based in the advanced industrialized economies use international standardization to consolidate and enhance global advantage, and to regulate the terms on which countries and their firms are inserted into the global economy. So when we talk about China's rise, I think we're talking about the rise of a country that is very much singular in the last several decades. And we have seen a similar development with Japan a little bit earlier. And also with regards to Japan, there was a lot of talk about the geopolitical aspects to it, talk about standards wars, right? So this is nothing new per se, but China has definitely been in a marginalized position for a very long time. So to understand China's transition from a rule taker to a rule maker in standardization, I think very generally it is important to situate standardization policy in China within broader industrial policy objectives. You'll find a variety of similar statements, but just as one example, in 2015, the central government, the State Council, sort of made public the official goal of China to become a 世界标准强国, a world standards power. This has been repeated since. And as I mentioned, this is very much intertwined and linked with industrial policy. That means that efforts to increase China's capacity in international standardization are related to efforts to capture first mover advantages in high-tech sectors. They are also interlinked with other strategy papers, such as the Made in China 2025 strategy and the Internet Plus strategy. And they are also related to a more general understanding in China, but I would say globally, that for companies, specifically when it comes nowadays to digital technologies, it is important to set standards in order to reap benefits and dominate markets. So in China, you have the very well-known saying that first-tier companies make standards, second-tier companies make technology, and third-tier companies make products. I, together with Professor Sarah Eaton at Humboldt University, have in the past years started to study China's standardization strategy. And I think it's sort of good to differentiate sort of the domestic side and the international side of it. On the domestic side, Tim has already mentioned several, I think, very important points that I don't have to reiterate. There has been an ongoing reform of the domestic standard setting system since 2015. As has already been mentioned, this includes efforts to make standard setting more market-driven. And this has also been enshrined in the standardization law of 2018 that, amongst many other things, has tried or tries to reduce the share of top-down mandatory standards developed by the SAC or by the MIT, and in contrast, expand bottom-up voluntary standards from industry associations. I think a very interesting development is, in fact, the formalization of Tuanbiao association standards. I have been in China for fieldwork until last week for 5 weeks and conducted several dozens of interviews with Chinese standardization experts. And the issue of Tuanbiao, I think, is very interesting. It is an attempt to increase sort of market-based standardization, but at the moment it is still sort of an endeavor in the making. So there is an attempt to re-regulate the ways in which association standards are actually made, because the government seems to have seen that too many actors are actually involved in making standards that do not have the actual expertise. And yeah, we can talk about that later. The latest sort of national development policy document that is of particular importance is the National Standardization Development Outline in 2021. But let me move on to the international dimension. And I would say there are two aspects to China's international standardization strategy. On the one hand, there is a focus on expanding influence in established international SDOs. Again, I don't have to mention or repeat what Tim has said. There has been the attempt to significantly increase participation in ISO and IEC institutions. There has been a sort of concerted effort to place Chinese officials in key leadership positions. There has been sort of a very strong focus on providing state subsidies from the central and from the local government for the submission of standard proposals. I recently learned that local governments are very active in that. And if you are a researcher at the university making a standard, this is can amount to quite a lot of prestige and good career opportunities. But again, more on that maybe later. Sort of within these institutions, again, that has been mentioned already, there is a focus on the area of critical and emerging technologies. The other side of the international standardization strategy are attempts to promote Chinese national standards in the global south. There's the, again, famous slogan of 中国标准走出去, Chinese standards going out. And here I would agree with Tim, whose work has been very influential for us as well, that there is a key role of the Belt and Road Initiative with several action plans with a variety of bilateral cooperation agreements and multilateral initiatives and training bases. An interesting development has been that a so-called BRI Regional Standards Forum has been mentioned in the China Standards 2035 policy writing process. However, it has not been included in the final outcome in the 2021 National Standards Development Strategy. However, my interviews in China in recent weeks show that this is, on the one hand side, still an idea that is lingering in China. On the other hand, there has been not much positive feedback also from BRI countries in actually establishing that. So there are different areas in which a standardization forum makes actually sense from the perspective of BRI countries. And when you talk about critical and emerging technologies, a lot of BRI participating countries have not the capacity, willingness, and expertise to actually debate that in a related forum. So I think other sectors would be more important. Let me move on now to the sort of reactions. Sarah Eaton and I have tried to analyze a variety of different initiatives, and I've done several presentations on one particular case of cooperation as a reaction to China's rise. And this is the so-called Sino-German Industry 4.0 cooperation. So this particular cooperation has existed since 2015, and it is focused specifically on the development and submission of mutually supported standard proposals to international STOs by Chinese and German experts. There are specific technical expert groups on topics such as IT security, AI, predictive maintenance, and others. Don't get me wrong, there is nothing singular in bilateral cooperations between German stakeholders and stakeholders from other countries. Germany has cooperation agreements with other countries. China has cooperation agreements with other countries. But I think what is specific here is that from both sides, but particularly from the German sides, from those experts involved, they deem that cooperation particularly successful. So a German standardization expert said that it is the most successful one that they have been engaged with. So I would argue that this form of cooperation is, or can be analyzed as a containment strategy through cooperation. So we studied the reasons for why Chinese and German standards experts are participating in this cooperation, and I'm leaving out sort of the Chinese aims for the moment and focus on the motives of German participants. And it becomes very clear that this cooperation, or one key goal of this cooperation, is to integrate and socialize China into global STOs. So by cooperating with China on a regular basis, by working on specific topics of mutual importance, German standard experts, both from DIN, but also from private companies, try to sort of keep China in the system, avoid that China would sort of go forward in the direction of a fragmentation of the international standardization system, and thereby also keep the important role of Germany in international STOs. So again, just to put that down, I think this is one example of a cooperation agreement, and I think these cooperation agreements from key stakeholder countries in Europe can be understood as containment through operation, keeping China in, but also controlling the individual position of power in STOs. Another, and I'm stopping with this is my final slides. Another example, an example to the contrary, are initiatives in recent years that focus on transatlantic alliance building. And here one case would be the so-called US-EU Trade and Technology Council. This Trade and Technology Council has been established in 2021. It is a alliance between between the US government and the European Commission. And standardization is by far not the only topic in this Trade and Technology Council that is of matter. However, I think it's symbolic enough that the working group 1 out of 10 is actually on technology standards. And there have been several remarkable results. So there has been a successful establishment of a strategic standardization information system, for instance, and also the definition of priority areas for transatlantic cooperation. I would argue that the TC has to be seen as part of a US-led effort to establish an alliance of like-minded partners in order to contain China's growing standards power. And I think this becomes particularly visible and understandable if we put it in a broader US context. The US government has, as we've heard already, also itself released a standardization strategy, and Chinese stakeholders are faced with several forms of backlash particularly by US participants in consortia, in different consortia organizations, but also within the ISO and the ISC. However, and this is really the end, I think that this transatlantic alliance is rather fragile. While stakeholders in Europe generally welcome the attention to the China challenge in international standardization, stakeholders from Europe fear, again, an increasing fragmentation of the international standardization system. So as a European business representative told us in an interview, the main issue is not to break the whole system. Europe is lucky here, lucky that standardization is strong in Europe. If conditions deteriorate, then the importance of Europe in this context will diminish. And another representative told us, we don't want to create parallel worlds where resources are wasted unnecessarily. So the idea here is that there is I would say, a reluctance from actual standard experts in actual European STOs on how much to invest in this transatlantic alliance, because they don't want to further fragment the international standardization system and sort of push China out of other forms of cooperation. I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Daniel. It's nicely complementing what kind of Tim already presented, and you already bring the US perspective into the game, which is or the US as a partner, which is probably a topic for an additional webinar coming up then. But now I will give the ladies the word and the floor. Susan Wittke is the first one. She is kind of doing research on standards with focus in China since more than 10 years. She is linked to the Würzburg University and the Bonn University. And whereas kind of Daniel looked a little bit more on the collaborative perspective, she has also some kind of maybe a little bit of different complementary perspectives to present, where maybe collaboration might be also challenged by. And therefore, I give Susan the floor.
Thank you, Knut. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks to all the participants and panelists. Yeah, it is really nice to see how much the area of education and academic research on standardization, especially with the focus on China and beyond, is flourishing. When Sabrina and me started this journey 10 years ago, there were not so many people around. I would like to go forward with the next slide. Thanks, Maria. So my title is China's Ambitions in ICT Standardization, Lessons for the Future. I think a lot of things were said already, so I will put the slide a little bit shorter. What we see is actually, and this is an official announcement, however, I mean, as in every state, official announcement also should have a practical test. So in general, State Council said there will be kind of parallel transformation, national, international, mutual transformation of the own standardization system. I think this is important to know. And also that they want to reach a conversion rate of international standards for 85%. However, I think we could fill an entire new workshop like this just talking about adoption of international standards and how to measure this adoption or conversation rate in general. I did a detailed research together with Sabrina Weidmann on this topic, and we found out it is still very hard to measure this from a quantitative perspective, especially because it is often hard to say why the standard is identical or modified, adopted. So more access to standard documents in this case would help the researchers in this field a lot. However, we also see from the State Council that by 2035, it is aimed to have a standardization management system with Chinese characteristics, whatever this means in detail. If you could click through. Thanks, Maria, for guiding through the presentation. I think this is something everybody here in this panel, and as also with the discussion, the people that attended here know already. The idea of third-tier companies make products. Daniel also mentioned it. Second-tier companies make technology. I sometimes like to say kind of patent-protected technologies, because I'm coming from the field of patent data analytics, but however, not speaking officially for my employer now. And first-tier companies make standards. I think that is a saying we know for a very long time. Actually, Dan Bresnitz, Michael Murphy already mentioned it 2012 in their really cool book, One of the Red Queen. And it is perhaps in China already a saying we no longer time. So what is China actually focusing on? If we are going to the next slide, if we look on standardization activities for today, we will speak about ICT. So I think this is not surprising. I sometimes call it a kind of first cooperation and perhaps contestation field in the field of setting standards. So everybody knows also about the involvement, especially of Huawei, but also ZTE and other Oppo, other companies in this field. I will have a more deep dive later on. If we could click through, thanks. Then another one, autonomous driving, or everything related to intelligent connected vehicle, electromobility. So a lot of things are for sure putting in this basket. Then quantum computing, also not surprising. There's also a large focus on. And the last one is Industry 4.0. Daniel already mentioned here also this cooperation mechanism that was installed between China and Germany, for example, in this field. So it's also a specific field of focus. So putting this to the timeline, I would say this entire field about ICT, mobile communication, perhaps started already and in the 2000 somehow years, especially when we look at Huawei, also if you're looking from a patent perspective, and last until 2010, and especially until now. I mean, if we are looking at this future 6G development process and conferences that are organized in this field from China, with claims that there will be the 6G standard in 2029. So we see a major contestation field. And for sure, other areas, Sabrina Weidmann, with whom I'm doing research a long time ago, was doing a lot of research about this field also, and how China, kind of was leapfrogging, I would say, especially in the field of electric vehicle industries, automobile industry, not traditional one. So just jumping over traditional technologies directly to newer technologies affiliated with automobile, and and all the others kind of new contestation fields. I mean, for sure this year just rough timing, hard to say exactly when it started. If we switch to the next slide, we could actually see a system that, a mechanism that Sabrina just found out, published in 2018, but she found it out in her PhD that we did together with the share of Professor Doris Fischer. So we both started actually with research on technical standards in China. So myself about the energy efficient building industry, and she did it about electric vehicle. And it was kind of interesting because we both came to a very similar conclusion, that there is this kind of specific standards development concept that can be applied to China. So means the country doesn't matter, it's China. Actually, we also enlarged this and made a robustness check of this mechanism, and also with another study that we just published 1 year ago with Olvas. So we see 3 phases, whether about the likelihood that countries adopt international standards, will set own deviating or diverging standards, or set international standards also. So, and it's pretty interesting because especially in the electric vehicle industry, we saw that there was at the first time an attempt to adopt international standards, but more from a rigid system of standards. So actually, in the second phase, we saw that Chinese stakeholders gained much more skills and technological expertise to set these standards. And in the third final phase, it is even possible, as we see it currently, if it comes to autonomous driving and all the specific applications in an autonomous car, or in the intelligent connected vehicle, we also see that it's possible to go into the international standardization phase. And we see actually also that when we made this research, and we further also double-checked this research with industry representatives, and we asked them really clearly, how do you perceive the Chinese participants in these technical committees? So is there like a long guided hand, invisible hand of the Chinese state behind setting by intention, deviating, diverging standards, and so on? We are actually pretty skeptical about this general, some could even say accusations sometimes against China, because we found, okay, if everybody has ever sit in a technical committee, these processes inside are very difficult. It's very technical based, very fact based, and it's also the consensus is reached on a common ground. So it means everybody should agree. Or there are majorities that might maybe try to overrule others. It is not as easy. And so we actually also are a little bit skeptical about this. And I'm not sure Tim or Daniel already mentioned. No, Daniel mentioned it when referring to root. What we also see is that we think it's just a natural right of every country catching up or coming as a latecomer to standardization, that this deviating or diverging standard phase is pretty normal. However, let us go to the next slide. If somebody has more questions about this, we could have a detailed look. So about the ICT standards, I just had a little bit research around, because it's my hobby, want to find out more how to really assess and measure deviation and what really deviation means. So I try to check it in the field of ICT technology. So for example, double-checked some specific initiatives coming from China between 1993 to 2011, for example, and also what are the international counterparts on their side, and also who are the initiators. So let us perhaps not go too much here into detail, considering the time. If somebody is interested about this, please also reach out to me. If you could click a little bit further, Maria, then yes, we could highlight these 2 cases. I will like to have a deep dive on this, the TD-SCDMA standard, for example, and the WAPI standard. I consider them as 2 kind of initiatives. China tried to set diverging standards for specific reason, security reason, but also local reasons. But they failed in this. And if we have a look at the next slide, there are some specific reasons that I found. For example, the WAPI standard is pretty famous, maybe everybody knows. So what we actually see is that it was tried to set up as a competitor to the Wi-Fi standard and kind of enforced by the Chinese government. So foreign companies, for example, they need to have collaborations with these licensed firms to join. So however, the United States had complaints at the WTO about that this is a TBT obligation. So however, at the end, this try or attempt was a failure. Especially the domestic companies in China themselves didn't want to have it. So it has really very limited measurement. And also most of the foreign companies were resisting against it. As a conclusion for this case, to push the button once more, please. Thanks a lot. We say it was unsuccessful at the international level. But however, we see here already a very early indicator how much technical standards also have a security dimension and might have also some impact on free trade principles. But we saw, that's why I call this part of my contribution today, Lessons for the Future, that China was learning a lot from this experience and also emphasized more on collaborative approaches further on. If we go to the next slide, sorry, Betty, I try to be a little bit faster. The TD-SCDMA case snapshot, we see here a homegrown Chinese 3G mobile communication standard that was tried to establish and was also not working. For example, it was mainly driven by China Mobile as one of them, but also some others. They also tried to be more collaborative and partnered with Siemens and other companies. And actually also the standard was accepted by the ITU in 1999 as one of 3 official 3G standards. So we see here that the Chinese government was on the one hand funding this project, but also taking the risks and trying to be the regulator. So what Tim, for example, already mentioned about lock-in effects and so on. We had a kind of lock-in effect. The TD-SCDMA standard became outdated in fact. And 4G development was going on. So as a consequence from technical perspective, there was a kind of lack of widespread adoption and other issues. So if we click further, we see also here, although the Chinese government and the actors related, I mean, it's not the Chinese government, everybody who's kind of affiliated with China knows it's not a homogeneous actor there, so sorry for the simplification. However, this was also a failure. We see, especially although the domestic market and the government supported is, we also see it as important that some part of technical standards need to be compatible with international standards. So another one where we would see, okay, here really is a success story, would really call it like this. I'm not going now too much deep in political discussions. We see that Huawei, for example, especially if it comes to 4G, 5G development, there is a lot of things going on and a lot of successful things. For example, in Leonard Short, perhaps he's also here in the chat, I just saw him, had a very interesting investigation together with Rudi Bakers about this. So they counted how successful the standard contribution of Huawei, for example, have been. We see that there was almost a 30% adoption rate from, contributions and approved consultations rate. So this is pretty impressive, I would say. There are also others like ZTE, but Huawei is really dominant here. And and I just mentioned if it comes to 6G, there are significant contribution to the ITU IMT 2030 Global 6G vision. For example, Huawei has putting 5 types of 6G usage scenarios there. Betty also has reported via CESEC, via her channel CESEC about this and 14 capabilities. And just last year in December, they hosted this Global 6G Development Conference. This was also pretty interesting. So I would perhaps more call it a lesson learned. And as a conclusion for this, we could say whether or not actually all this contribution of Huawei were ultimately approved. We could also say it's a kind of preemption strategy. So with a kind of proactive standardization strategy coupled with large R&D investment and improved technical standard capacities, and really bringing other participants in the technical committees to their limit of money and human resources and how to contribute to these technical standard scale. Yes, thanks very much. If you have more questions, feel free to reach out to me, and maybe I could also introduce a little bit more about data analytics for standards and what I mean with this. But now the floor is ready. Sorry for taking long.
No, thanks a lot, Susan. To kind of complement a little bit the relationships we have with China, and also the challenges you elaborated on. Also Europe is facing, and that leads me immediately out to our last speaker, Dr. Betty Xu, who is dedicated to organize the collaboration with China, because she's the seconded European standardization expert since 2014. That means also a very long kind of experience she can refer to, and therefore I give her immediately the floor. Betty, the floor is yours.
Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Well,
yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Knut, for the introduction. And today I will make some summary about how China is performed for the international ICT standards, and discuss some opportunities and challenges EU and China collaboration on the international ICT standardization. First, make a little bit introduction about CESEC project. My name is Betty Xu, and I'm working as the seconded European standardization expert in China. And this project is co-funded by 5 European standardization related organizations: European Commission, EFTA Secretariat, CEST, ILAC, and ESSI. And we have a small team based in Beijing, and our work is to promote European and international standards in China, improve the context between project partners and different levels of Chinese administrations, industry, and standardization bodies. We try to enhance the visibility and understanding of European standardization systems in China, gathering regulatory and standardization information, and timely report back to the European stakeholders, and undertake some technical lobbies if it is necessary on behalf of the European stakeholders and industries. And our goal is to support European policies and European standardization organizations' strategic objectives in China, and to set up the EU-China dialogue and cooperation in the field of standardization. And notably, we support the framework cooperation agreement in place between the European Standardization Organization, CEST, ILAC, ANSI, and the Chinese Standardization Organization, SAC. We also support the European Commission and the Chinese government regulatory dialogue and standardization working group cooperation. for the standardization, cooperation, and communication. And we have been discussed today a lot about the how China is performed for what is the strategy and what is the performance and how the role of China international standardization activity in ICT area. I have to admit I was very surprised to see that so many European academic experts are so familiar with Chinese standardization, and team Daniel and Susan, you did a very perfect job on understanding the Chinese. So I don't repeat the thing you have discussed, and just to make some summary. First, what is the power of China? So this is I believe that the standards is the reflection of technology, and technology is a reflection of the economic development. So in the last 10, 20 years, China economy has increased a lot. And the not only the economy, but also the technical power increased a lot, which result in the, I believe, which is the reason and result in the incremental of international activities for the standardization in China. So that is why, in a summary, for the leaderships of China standardization activities in ISO can show that in 2021, in 2011 to 2020 and 2023, China's TC and SC secretariat has increased a lot, which is under in the similar numbers with US, Germany, and Japan. And others, for example, the ISO secretaries and convenership or the chairmanships, which shows that China is just behind Germany, US, and France. For IEC, I have the number for secretariat of September 2024. Unfortunately, China is still the 6.5% for the secretaryship in the IEC, behind Germany, US, Japan, France, and UK. And that is why sometimes China often complains that they should have more positions because of the economic size of China and the fact that China is a big manufacturing factories all over the world. For the ITU ICT standardization activities, China even performed better compared to ISO and IEC. In ITU, this is a number for the countries of membership, like US, which is the number of 2021, a little bit different from what I believe team has shown. So US is number 1, and China number 2, UK, Japan, and Germany. And for the SD Vice President, China number 1, followed by South Korea and some other countries. And then the ITUT chairs and vice chairs position, China number 1, and then followed by South Korea, Japan, and the for the European countries, we will have France and UK in the top 10 numbers. And for the working group posted by the report for ITUT working group, China count to 29%, while the obviously US and Germany, US, Germany, or some other EU countries did not show the biggest number in 2021. So I have to say that these statistical numbers are from a Chinese magazine, but their research result is from actually some European academic results. Finally, for 3GPP, now I have the number published on the Chinese standardization magazine as well. and the number is in October 2021. China counts on 29% for the membership, and also the working group chairs and vice chair positions. China is the #1 compared to other countries, and contributions for the 5G standards. Don't ask me how the number come. They have academic research statistics methods. So they believe that Huawei 26%, Ericsson 23%. We will visit. I saw Alton is from IC is also in the participation list. I will visit IC in October, and I hope 3GPP can give me some updated number for the 5G or for any other activities. But I believe that this is just some number of statistics indicators to show how China is performing in recent years in international standardization organizations, ISO, IEC, and ITC, and ITU. So the conclusion is that first, no matter the number is accurate or sometimes there could be some errors there, but we do see some trend of China's influences in international standardization grow dramatically in the last 2 decades. And compared to the traditional technological standard sectors like those in ISO and IEC, we definitely see that China plays an even more influential role in international or global digital standards. However, I've been in China, working with China stakeholders, with Chinese governments. China still believes that compared to China's economic size and also the number of populations, China did not get enough or proper positions in some of the areas in ISO, IEC, ITU, and the international standardization organizations. So it comes to the question for all the European stakeholders, that is the impacts of China's growing influence in international technical standards. So sometimes we see there's a lot of, for example, a lot of government fundings for the standards, and China try to use some KPI to increase the number of secretaries and the KPI for the different organizations or government owned institutions or the state-owned companies to have more international standards, which sometimes show that a lot of experts propose a lot of new working items in ISO, IEC, ITU, and some of them may not have a very high quality, or it's really not a very necessary area for standardization. So sometimes we have to think about, is China a break of the current international standardization systems or rules, or sometimes is China playing fairly for the standardization activity? Because last year or in 2022, 2023, German government also organized some discussion about whether German government should funding for the or make some subsidy for the companies or the enterprises to participate in international standards, or reward those who made international standards proposals. Although the answer is no, but we have to see that in China, Chinese government, different levels of governments do have a lot of fundings for the industries, for the research organizations, if they are successfully got international standards. And such situation, how to deal with such growth? Are they opportunities, or are they really challenges for the European industries and European stakeholders? So here is my analysis or some of my observations. So I believe that for the growth of China international standardization activity and China's standardization strategy internally, and also China's activity in the Belt and Road Initiative or Belt and Road countries, we can see there are some opportunities in this scenario. First, China is still in favor of globalization for trade and international trade. So therefore, the industry of China try to exporting their products to Europe, to Africa, to Belt and Road countries. They have sometimes we call overcapacity of manufacturing. So China still wants to make standards in the international level, like ISO, IEC, ITU, and 3GPP. So to facilitate the international trade or international exporting. Second, China still tends to collaborate with Europe, while US is comparatively difficult and sometimes even impossible. For example, in ICT area, like Wi-Fi, like Bluetooth, like some other US ICT consortia, China telecommunication companies or manufacturers do meet some challenges. So they try to collaborate with Europe and still regarded European as the biggest international or overseas market for their international trade or exporting. And third, harmonized ICT standards between China and the EU will facilitate trade and foster the ICT products and services exporting to China. So this is opportunities. So China still want to work with Europe, and also it is challenges. The challenges for the European stakeholders, the industries, the government, and also other stakeholders is first the geopolitical uncertainty. Between China and the US with some trade wars, some political intentions, and even some other uncertainties still exist, and both US and China try to collaborate with EU, and so this is one challenge. And another is fairness of collaboration. So for the last 10-20 years, sometimes especially based in Beijing, I often receive the complaints from the European industries that they cannot equally participate in Chinese standardization activities. They do not have their voices for the standards drafting or something like this. So why in Europe, the European standardization systems is fairly open to all the Chinese companies if you are legally registered in EU. Third, unbalanced benefits for one party in the bilateral trade. We both know that recently EU is trying to discuss with China on the e-vehicle tariff increase, and also the some trade issues on the solar, thermal, battery. So sometimes we did see some unfair or unbalanced trade relationship between EU and China. So this is also a challenge of whether we in Europe should work with China in standardization activity. And last is how to get reciprocity from the collaboration, not only in the international level, but in the domestic level, because China, not like the European standardization systems where we Sensan-ILAC and ISO and IEC signed the cooperation agreement, Vienna Agreement and the Frankfurt Agreement of maximally adopt the international standards, while in China, the international standardization activity and domestic standardization activity are sometimes quite independent. We sometimes see that China proposed international standards in ISO, IEC, or even ITU or 3GPP, but it often happens in ISO and IEC, that they proposed new standards, but they did not adopt it as the domestic one, or did not implement it, the international standards in China. So we have to see that we cooperate, we get the reciprocity from such cooperation. And then some recommendations from from how to collaborate with China on international ICT standards. So I think I have 4 points. First, we have to understand, balance, to identify, and with reciprocity. First, understand. First, we have to deeply and accurately understand China's ICT standardization strategy and activity. Sometimes, because of the competition or the trade war between China and the US, like some technology has been banned from US to China. So some China try to set up the deviated or independent ICT standards. We do see that something happens in these areas, like short-range telecommunication, like as we said, Wi-Fi or similar white line wireless standards. So we have to deeply understand, and also for the artificial intelligence, whether China has their own concept or own agenda for the standards. So first, China, I have to admit, it's not a very transparent systems. Standardization activities sometimes is not easy to be followed or understand. So I strongly recommend the European stakeholders to put some efforts to deeply and accurately understand China standardization activities, then make the strategy and decisions to think about how to cooperate. Second is balance. We have to, from European side, to balance the trade benefits, and maybe in the future to balance the European Union's and the member states' political agenda and strategy. The day before I joined the SAMAC receptions from US Embassy, they talked about US like national security, this and that. But anyway, I believe that sometimes industries and governments may not have the similar agenda or similar position on certain trading or industry activities. Second, to balance the unharmonized standards if not collaborate. So whether decoupling of ICT standards, how in the future to set up the interoperability, we need to balance this as well to set up. So I think standardization cooperation is not only a political agenda, it's also a business agenda to save costs, to think about the benefits of cooperate and the risk of not cooperate. And then identify where cooperation is possible and beneficial. So I believe this is based on the deep and accurate understanding of Chinese standardization activity. Last but not least, we have been emphasized many times, that is cooperate with reciprocity. So I believe this is all from my side. And if you have any questions or comments or some different thoughts, please do not hesitate and contact me. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Betty. And again, thank you everybody for your contributions. Officially, kind of, we are running out of time, but since we have some traffic in the chat and also in the Q&A, I would also like now to give the plenary the floor to raise or elaborate on questions which might have been already mentioned in the chat. Otherwise, I have some ideas. If nobody please raise your hand. There was the one question by Marianne from Bloomberg. You want to elaborate on that? Are you still with us? Yes. She disappeared. Or Tim, you want to respond on her question?
Well, she's there, I think. She just wrote in the chat. So
Yeah, she's oh, but she can't speak. Oh, okay, too bad. But maybe you can a little bit jump on what she brought up in the chat.
yeah, I mean, there were a bunch of interesting questions, so I hope I recall the right one. But I think the question was mainly related to whether we consider not only sort of the increasing engagement in standard development, both nationally or also internationally, but also sort of the increasing use of standards related to regulation, to binding regulation as part of this development. And I mean, that is certainly a very relevant trend. I wasn't sort of in the chat already, I explained sort of I didn't sort of put that sort of under this category of geopolitics of technical standard setting yet, but I think it's a very relevant and a very good point. I mean, one could really sort of see this because it's an increasing trend. It relates to the element that I didn't touch upon due to time, the legal aspect, that standards, if they're referenced in regulation, especially in larger entities, larger countries, the EU, China, large markets with market power, that they can unfold also extraterritorial effects. And what we do see is also in Europe that we have sort of increasing demand from regulators to private actors to develop certain standards that follow regulation. And a growing threat also to sort of replace standardization with technical specifications that are then developed by state actors. And that is, of course, sort of a means to put pressure also on standard developing organizations to follow the political guidelines or sort of the regulatory intention of state actors. So I think that is indeed sort of a very relevant aspect that I hadn't sort of considered in that basket, but that's a very good point that I'm gonna take onto my thinking and research. I may not have a good response within sort of having heard of this 15 or 20 minutes ago, but I think it's a very good point.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, good. We experience currently the various standardization requests coming out of the different regulations being released in the last 1-2 years, and probably more to come. That means at the European side, this can be certainly confirmed. Another question was about the WTO preference for international standards. Is Marnik still here to elaborate on that? Or he's here. Maria, can you give him the right to speak?
Let me see. Can you repeat the name of the person?
Marnix, he is in the chat. And the other kind of quote in the question was from Martin Chapman about that the US kind of is withdrawing from ITU-ET. This was also new to me.
It did. I mean, but I think that trend is partly reversed. It was largely withdrawing under the Trump administration, and it certainly hasn't sort of restated all its previous engagement under the Biden administration. But I think that trend has somewhat reversed. Let's see how November's elections go and what that will imply for US engagement in ITU. But I mean, if we want to understand sort of the rapid growth of China in ITU-T, I think this is a very relevant comment that indeed under the Trump administration, the US was withdrawing, not completely, but to a significant extent from ITU. So leaving sort of a vacuum that other actors, including China, could of course fill.
Yeah, Martin, maybe.
Yeah, so I think
Hello.
the US engagement or disengagement started way before that, like at least around the end of the sort of the first decade of this century in 2010. And pretty much, I think that coincided with the rise in China, and then there was a vacuum. And I think it's only recently, as you say, with the Biden administration, they've made a more strategic decision to re-engage. So it was interesting. Potentially their absence helped create this this sort of vacuum. Just an interesting observation.
Marnix, you want to speak? Thank you, Martin.
Yeah, I can speak
Oh,
now. Yes,
right.
yes. Well, recently to the topic of international standards having precedence over regional standards. In this case, in a specific case, ETSI had to adopt an IEC standard where that standard was in place, whereas they were also developing their own standards. So it can indeed play a role. I don't think in that particular case it was a very geopolitical event. It was a rather practical issue. But I mean, it is a case where it's a mechanism we have to be very aware of. We always think of Europe as a region that is very strong in developing standards. It's very anchored in the European Union, the way it plays a role, but it can, by having to adopt these international standards, Europe will lose some of its autonomy in setting its own standards for its own market. So that is what something to consider. Any comments from others? Because there were some comments to state that this was not always the case. I'm not sure when those exceptions can take effect.
Yeah, unfortunately, the Olya who made the comment, she left, and she argues that under some circumstances, one can deviate from the international standards. Since I just read that Tim is going to leave us. Oh yeah, Susan, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Knut, can I just jump in for 1 second? Not all deviations or diverging technical standards are actually really a problem. I think that's something we didn't speak about. I mean, for example, when I made research about passive house standard in China that they wanted to adopt from the German passive house standard. I mean, China has different climate zones as well. So not everything here is always just totally the same and can be adopted 100%. That's something sometimes people do not speak about or take out. So I would say it's hard to judge that it's always by intention and has some severe reason, and it's always the invisible hand of the state behind. Yeah, but maybe, yeah, that's another issue.
Thank you for the clarification. Since some have to get lunch, others have to get here dinner. We conclude now this webinar on China, and there's more to come. We will have some elections in US, and already the US was already mentioned here, and therefore it probably makes sense also then to consider a little bit maybe the US in the next STEAN ICT webinar on the geopolitics of standards. I thank all the speakers also for being quite disciplined in the sense of keeping your time slot. Also, thanks for the contributions in the sense of the chat, the Q&As, and also sharing publications, even some I didn't know, which is good. Therefore, I also learned something which I didn't know before that the webinar. And if you have ideas, topics, being interested in contributing to our series here, please contact me, then we will consider this. And the slides and the recordings will be available on the website. Thanks, Maria, for the technical kind of infrastructure and your colleagues you provided. Everything was stable, everything went well, therefore was very successful, and we probably hopefully see each other at the next webinar on the geopolitics of ICT standardization. Have a good day, have a nice evening, see you soon. Bye-bye.